I thought that the Russians would give the West longer before they moved towards recognition, which is, of course, exactly what they did yesterday. I thought there would be another week or maybe even two of diplomacy, but for reasons that are apparent only to the Kremlin, they decided to move ahead. And it seems that when you take the emotions out of it, which is very difficult to do, I agree, right now, that Putin has taken the path of least military risk. In other words, there's been a de jure, a legal, from the Russian perspective, recognition of what has been de facto a reality on the ground for about 7 years, which is that the Donbass regions, the two people's republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, have now been recognized by Russia as not being part of Ukraine, but they've been under an economic blockade by the Kiev government, and they've been, for all intents and purposes, segregated from the rest of the nation. And it took the Russians really 7, 8 years to recognize the reality on the ground. So now the question is really about the borders of these political units that the Russians have recognized. And I think we'll see this question unfolding over the next days and weeks.
If you look at the fact that there was a pledge not to expand NATO to Russia's borders, and then in reality, for the last 3 decades, you've had NATO consistently expanding to Russia's borders, which in itself is a threat to Russia. If by definition, a military alliance that does not allow you to enter that alliance is expanding to your borders, then by definition, you're an enemy, which means you're under threat. And then you have the fact that you had this coup in Ukraine, a change of government to install a pro-Western government inside Kiev. Then I do think Russia has grounds to be suspicious, especially since the only resolution to this crisis, which is something called the Minsk Accords, finalized by the Ukrainian, agreed to by the Ukrainian government in 2015, has been stalled. Ukraine has not been willing to implement its main provision, which calls for autonomy for the Donbass region in exchange for the demilitarization of the rebels fighting Kiev. That is the only solution on the table, but Kiev has refused to implement it because effectively that solution would take NATO membership off of the table. And the U.S., instead of pressuring its client in Kiev to implement the accords, I think has been encouraging it to ignore it, to the point where just last week, and this has not been reported pretty much anywhere, there were talks on reviving Minsk, brokered by European countries. And at those talks, the Ukrainian government refused to negotiate with the rebels, which makes a resolution impossible, because if you won't negotiate with the side you're fighting, there won't be a resolution. So given this history up until the present moment, I do think that Russia has ample reason to be suspicious of U.S. motives.